All right. Are we ready?
Ready.
Okay. I'm gonna share my screen. Oh, hang on. Sorry. Actually, Summer, you have to approve me for screen sharing.
There we go.
Lovely. Okay. Um, so I'm first just gonna kind of like quickly scroll through the actual unit plan itself, just so you can get a sense of how it's laid out. So my unit is Habitats and Communities. It's a grade 4 unit. So of course, following the backwards design structure, we have our big ideas, which are the overall and specific expectations that go into the essential questions. We have our competencies listed, and then the content is essentially just the answers to the essential questions that I created. For our assessment, it goes through assessment 4 as and of learning. I'm going to go through these in more detail again. I'm just scrolling through so you can see the whole thing before I break it up. We have our day-to-day plan, which includes all of the lessons and the content that will be covered. Um, at the end, I included possible extensions, cross-curricular connections, differentiation, as well as accessibility and other considerations. Um, some resources that are also embedded into the lessons. And then I have my lessons at the bottom. So I included 3 lessons here, one on carrying capacity, one on food webs, and one on what is a habitat, which would be the first lesson. So I'm just going to stop sharing that and I will share that with both of you in case you ever find yourself teaching grade 4. I'm happy for you to like go ahead and use it. Um, and I will share my slides. All right, so habitats and communities unit plan. So I basically just like put broke it up into sections so I can go through it more easily. So like I said, these are the big ideas into essential questions, competencies, the content. I'm not going to go over all this in detail because I feel like the meat of it all is in the assessment and the lesson. So for our assessment, we have our diagnostic, and I went with the KWL chart that students can add to throughout the unit. So every after every lesson, they'll get 2 sticky notes, one to add to the Wonder chart and one to add to the Learn chart, and both of those will be posted in the classroom throughout the unit. For our formative, again, that's the exit notes, the exit tickets, and there's also some opportunities for ongoing evaluation. For example, I have a food chain and food web activity as well as graphing during lesson 7. But the real crux is in the summative assessment or the cumulative task. So there's 3 parts to the cumulative task. So the unit should kind of end with this habitat tour. So part A is a habitat map. So students will create a map of a local environment. It could be their like schoolyard, it could be a local park, it could be a ravine. It's an area that we would go to together and they will find habitats. These can be pretty like simple habitats. So we're thinking like an oak tree or under a rock or that kind of straightforward thing. And then they'll make a map with that includes these habitats. Um, the second part is a brochure. So the brochure is going to translate everything they've learned about habitats and communities and should also include some specific aspects related to the map that they created. So there might be a specific species that they found that they would include in their brochure. And then the third part, which is also kind of a celebration of their work, is the tour. So we would invite a guest into the classroom. The teacher will photocopy and print several copies of the maps and brochures. Those would be distributed, and then students can kind of like deliver a tour to the guest. Importantly, this is like a pretty substantial project. It's quite extensive, so it's really important to scaffold the learning by splitting the work into multiple lessons. And you'll see when I go through the day to day that this is actually embedded throughout the unit. It's not something that's all done right at the end. This project could be done in groups or independently, but I have noted if students do it in groups, they should make a contract before starting. So this is just like quickly, I'm going to go through the day-to-day plan so you can get a sense of what it looks like. So we have our intro that's starting the KWL chart. We have lesson 1, what is a habitat? And then I tried to make it easy by including in this smaller text box the key content of each lesson, and that is drawn directly from the content piece at the beginning of the unit plan. Lesson 2 is the habitat map. So this is when they'll be doing that part A of that cumulative task, and that may take multiple days. Lesson 3 is looking at food and food chains. Lesson 4 is food webs. Lesson 5 is classifying animals. and organisms. Lesson 6 is adaptations, and I've included some read alouds potentially there as well. Lesson 7 is carrying capacity. Um, Importantly, sorry, I don't want to miss this because it's very important. At lesson 5, you'll see it says um, that during that lesson, the teacher will introduce part B of the summative assignment, and students will get to start drafting their brochure. So they've already done the habitat map, and now, like by lesson 5, we're talking about the brochure, and then they're getting time to go and start inputting that information that they've already learned. So they're inputting what is a habitat, what is a community, food chains, food webs, all that kind of stuff. And then same with adaptations. At the end of the lesson, there's going to be an opportunity for students to research an animal or organism that they've listed in their habitat map and explore its adaptations and incorporate that into their brochure. Um, Lesson 7 is carrying capacity. And then lesson 8, we have work period. Now that might take a couple days. This is essentially to like finalize their habitat map and brochure. And then lesson 9 is the tour and celebration. So we have guests at the classroom, and then students do that tour. So I've listed some possible extensions. I've listed quite a few. I can't go through them all in depth just because of uh, I don't have enough time. But essentially, I've included like a book here that's authored and illustrated by an Indigenous creator. It's from a great program, the Primary Awesome Table. I also have suggested that with a unit like this, you could invite an Indigenous community member or elder to speak about habitats and relationships between animals, plants, humans, and the natural world. And then, of course, there's also local organizations. So I was thinking about EcoSpark, which Kadar and Summer, you probably remember, we did that session in Erin's class. So I'm sure there's all kinds of organizations, but EcoSpark would be an awesome one. Lots of cross-curricular connections, so it's related to the arts because students are drawing their maps. Language arts because they'll be writing their brochure, but this could also be extended into a creative writing project with a prompt like write a story from the perspective of a squirrel in their habitat or any organism in their habitat. And then mathematics in lesson 7. That lesson includes graphing data, and I have written out the lesson plan for that. Hopefully, we'll get to it, but differentiation, group work, I think supports the differentiation as students are allowed some choice in which parts of the project they want to contribute to. But there's also a great opportunity to incorporate other mediums if that is what, if the writing portion feels too much for students, or perhaps they just want to be creative. So instead of doing a brochure, for example, they could do a podcast or a walking tour delivered orally, or even I thought a video tour with a voiceover would be really cool. So some important considerations here. The time of year and weather, you're going to want to do it in early fall or in the spring or closer to the summer. Mobility. So a lot of the activities that I incorporated into the lesson plans are from Project Wild, which is a great resource, but they involve walking, running, or other physical activity. And I've listed some specific adaptations here to make sure that every activity could be meaningfully done regardless of mobility, so that you could assess that based on the class. And also, really importantly, I want to note that not all students will have a guest that they will want to invite to the classroom. So just being mindful of this, like maybe not saying let's invite our parents or let's invite our guardians. You could even skirt this issue altogether as the teacher, and invite kind of your own guests, maybe from the community or the school itself. I was thinking this would be a good project if you had reading buddies to invite the reading buddies in to do the habitat tours for the reading buddies. These are the resources. So really, I took a lot of the activities from Project Wild, but all of these are great, and some of them are books that I've included in the lesson plans. So I'll just go through this first lesson plan. What is a habitat? So essentially, we have our learning goals, materials listed, and then I have minds on, hands on, and essential questions. So for the minds on, students are going to go outside. We're going to ask, what do organisms need to survive? And we're looking for shelter, water, food, light, and air. We're going to divide them into 5 groups and assign each one of those needs. And then we're going to create a circle shoulder to shoulder, kind of alternating between all 5 needs. So they should be in order. And then students are going to turn to the right and take one step towards the middle of the circle. So they're kind of like all facing each other at this point, or facing the same direction. And then you're going to instruct everyone to sit down on the knees of the person behind them, keeping their knees together to support the person in front of them. This is going to feel like a bit nerve-wracking, but it does work. And then the facilitator would say, shelter, water, food, light, and air, and the proper arrangement are what is needed to have a suitable habitat. Then we'll stand up, have students talk about the necessary components of a good habitat, and then you can repeat the activity, but have one resource kind of disappear by saying something like, there's a drought this year, water needs to stand up, and the group is inevitably going to stumble or at least struggle to restructure themselves. And then you regroup and consolidate the learning through debrief. So right here, we're looking at what are the things that we need to make a good habitat. Again, as I've mentioned, this is one of those activities that does require physical contact and does require a pretty high level of mobility. So a great adaptation that I've listed in the unit plan would be to do this with something like blocks, like build a tower. If we take out all the blocks that are water, obviously the tower is going to fall, right? So the same learning, but adjusted based on the needs of the classroom. And then we have our hands-on, which has students kind of split up into groups, walking around to find evidence of wildlife in the environment, and then explore what organisms they found and how those organisms' needs are being met. Thinking especially, is this a good habitat? So again, we'd be in like maybe the schoolyard, we'd be looking for things like a bird's nest or even insects. Um, and this is a great precursor to lesson 2, which is starting the habitat maps as well. And I always list the essential questions. Some of my lesson plans do have direct instructional components, but this one where I felt the main learning was what is a habitat, what do organisms need to survive. This, I think, is mostly covered by the hands-on components. And then, as I've mentioned, I did do 2 other lesson plans. So one on what is a food web and one on carrying capacity. Um, but as I'm already at 11 minutes, I won't go through those. But Summer and Kadar, if you do want to use them, I am going to share the document with you. So yeah, thank you.
That's much appreciated, Sid. I'm actually in grade 4 for my placement right now.
Oh,
So
that's great.
this is really, really helpful because I'm like, I don't know anything about grade 4 curriculum. So thank you for sharing. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I'm in grade 5 as well. So I'd love to have it as well. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I can go next. Um, Let me make sure I have my timer ready. Okay. So I'm going to share one of my screens. So I'm basically going to start the way Sid started, showing my actual plan first, and then going through my presentation. So this was the unit plan template that I came up with. I had to design my own because I don't really think so well in the formats that we were given to choose from. So I had to develop my own unit plan template that includes the curriculum learning objectives, specific expectations, enduring understandings. Then I divided it by lessons, and each lesson has a probing question, a mental set, and then the body of the lesson. Then I have cross-curricular connections after so that I can scaffold where the lesson crosses with different curricula. And then I have resources for that. And then I have the formative and summative assessments in one place. Then the culminating task with the time, modifications, and accommodations that can be used across all of the above lessons, including accommodations and modifications for the culminating task, just because they're a little bit different, as well as additional resources that I could use if I wanted to throughout the lessons. Okay, so that's the actual plan. And then my presentation. Your patience is greatly appreciated. It is very weird using this while sharing my screen. Okay, so fractions, decimals, and percents. So my guiding framework is historically responsive learning lesson plan template. It was developed by Goldie Mohammed, and she's a professor of curriculum and instruction at the University of Illinois, and she has a focus on literacy, language, and culture. So she wrote an equity framework for culturally and historically responsive pedagogy, which connects to Gloria Ladson-Billings' definition of culturally relevant education. And Culturally relevant education has been proven to improve student motivation, self-esteem, and efficacy, and student success. The purpose of this template is to seamlessly integrate culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy into lessons, and it includes sections such as student identities, where they're from in a cultural context, and their backgrounds, their learning goals. So learning goals specifically that are their in relation to their identities, their skills, their intellect, and criticality. So basically major takeaways from the lesson and how it impacts their critical thinking, as well as student spark, which is just an alternate way of saying a minds on or a mental set. So this is how I started off developing my plan. I took more of a mind map approach because I found that using a linear template was really, really challenging for me. I kind of had to pull from what I thought was most important. So the overall expectations to what the actual unit is, the overall expectations. So it's kind of just like one big circle, essentially, starting from here all the way around the page. In retrospect, I would have used larger than 8.5 by 11, but it got the job done. Ooh. Expectations, overall and specific. So the expectations are from strand B, number sense, and your students are supposed to demonstrate an understanding of numbers and make connections to the way numbers are used in everyday life. I'm not going to go through all of the expectations because in theory, you could cover 4 of them, and that is not including cross-curricular expectations. And this way, I incorporated it into the unit plan to ensure that even though culturally relevant learning is integrated, we do still have board and provincial expectations to meet. So for enduring understanding, I want my students to understand that their cultures, their identities, and their ways of knowing matter. I find that in math, it's very hard to incorporate culturally relevant pedagogy, but if you find ways to incorporate their pop culture or their food or their clothes, that it tends to stick with students a lot better. I found that they engaged most during moments where their culture was talked about or things that actually interested them were talked about. Um, I want them to know that fractions, decimals, and percentages do have real life relevance. So when I was teaching this, because this is a grade 6 lesson, so when I was teaching this, I found that a lot of my students would ask, why do we need this? When do we use this? How are we ever going to have fractions in our lives? And so I took the opportunity to then explain to them and have them think about when they would have fractions, decimals, and percents be relevant. I also want them to know how to calculate equivalence between fractions, decimals, and percentages and what exactly they represent. So while using order of operations is important to these lessons, it is more important for me that they know how to calculate equivalence, what fractions are, and what decimals are, and what percentages are. So I broke it down into 5 different lessons, 3 for decimals and 2 for fractions. So the decimal lessons are lesson 1 is rounding, addition, and subtraction. Lesson 2 is multiplication, specifically division and long division. And then lesson 3 is comparing and ordering. So I did it in this way because to do rounding, addition, and subtraction, those are the easiest operations. And it also builds on their understanding of whole numbers as they would have learned while doing place value. Multiplication and division would build on addition and skills, would build on the addition skills that they learned. And then division, they would get used to the idea of doing a longer mathematical process because they already started doing multiplication first. And then I left comparing and ordering decimals for last because they would have a firm grasp on the above operations and what decimals are, enabling them to better understand the difference in size in decimals, so like tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. For fractions, they would review how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions. This would be a memory refresher for grade 5. I found that a lot of my students had a very strong understanding of fractions without me even having to go through a review lesson. So that is why I had review as a lesson in and of itself, but not necessarily a full what fractions are and how to use them. And then the second fractions lesson is fractions in history. And I decided to do this because I wanted to show how math is used in real life. And it's also a cross-curricular connection. And it also shows how math can play a role in in history and into the present. So, like for example, the ones that I chose to use were the Indian Act. So, like if you are half Indigenous on your mother's side, you do not qualify or you did not qualify for official Indian status under the Canadian Indian Act. And in the US Constitution, they had the three-fifths compromise. So that essentially allowed for only three-fifths of the votes of enslaved people to count towards elections, so that states that had more enslaved people did not have an unbalanced power during election time. I integrated probing questions throughout the lessons, but I amalgamated them here just so that it's easier to see. It gets students thinking about what they already know, whether they realize it or not, and what they're going to learn. And it also allows for early cross-curriculum connections. So what is precipitation and who's heard of dual citizenship are examples of crossing science and social studies. A lot of my students actually knew what dual citizenship was, and it was very impressive. And they were able to tell me that if someone has a baby on a flight, for example, they qualify for dual citizenship of the country they're going to and the country that their parent left. So they were on point. It was very impressive. I was very proud of them, and they hadn't thought of someone being half of one kind of citizen versus half of another kind of citizen until I asked them how it relates to fractions. So for the mental sets, I wanted to build on the probing questions, and this is an opportunity to incorporate their cultures and identities and make the lessons relevant to who the students are, where they are, and who and where their loved ones are and where they're from as well. And this is meant to evolve with students, current events, and culture. So if nothing else in the lesson changes, like for example, even if the curriculum expectations are the same for the better part of like 20 years, the mental sets can change with who the students are and what they think is cool to them. Wow, that 10 minutes goes by fast. Assessments. It's designed to divide evaluation into smaller chunks, create more opportunities for student improvement and success, and smaller assessment chunks reduces the weight of each assessment with the goal of reducing math and evaluation anxiety. So the smaller they are, the less pressure there is. The culminating task can be done independently or in pairs, which allows for collaboration, and it's an opportunity for students to become the teacher, either in a write-up to the teacher or in a class presentation, and another way to evaluate and demonstrate student learning. So for this one, I would have the students essentially pick a recipe and divide the recipe or multiply the recipe to feed additional people or to feed less people. So these are all my modifications and accommodations. So manipulatives can be used, such as base 10 blocks and fraction strips. Students can play math games in class. Questions can be broken down into smaller parts. So scaffolding the questions allows for them to be less intimidating and as well for them to be easier to be broken down. I have reduced the number of questions for students who are on IEPs just because they do tend to need a little bit more time to actually solve the math in front of them. Providing additional visual aids also really helps. So even if a fraction strip or a fraction circle doesn't work, you can always show a pizza and say, how would you divide this amongst your 6 friends if there's 12 slices of pizza? Allowing for extra time is an accommodation that can be provided to all students because not all the students all the time have the same amount of time dedicated to their work. And then the culminating task, students can work in partners. They can have a specific number of steps and or ingredients, or they can use smaller numbers for them to work with. And I could also provide a list of culturally relevant recipes to choose from. Thank you. Oh my gosh.
That's great, Summer. Even as you were presenting, I feel like there's so many things that I was like, oh, that's like a really great idea. I would include that in my unit planning or lesson planning. And I love how you incorporated so much of I don't know, like what's meaningful to students into math. That was really great.
Thank you. I hope this thing doesn't run out of time. Let's see what this upgrade business is.
Well, I have 9 minutes left. Okay, I'm
Yeah.
gonna run through it really quick.
I hope that's enough time, Kadar. Sorry.
No, it is. No, it is.
Okay.
How do I expand my screen? Okay, I'll just go like this. I think that expands it. Okay, so for me, my unit title is going to be Diverse Indigenous Cultures and Societies, grade 5, because I'm going to be teaching grade 5 during my placement. Strand B, People and Environments, the role of government and responsible citizenship, overall expectations, assess the responses of governments in Canada, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit governments. B2, use the social studies inquiry process to investigate Canadian social and environmental issues from various perspectives. B3, demonstrate an understanding of roles and key responsibilities of citizens and different levels of government in Canada, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit governments. Related, we're going to be looking at relationships, cause and consequence, perspectives, and significance, the big ideas. Citizens and governments need to work together in order to be able to address issues and effectively, fairly. When examining an issue, when is it important to understand who the different stakeholders are and consider their perspectives. To be active and effective citizens, Canadians need to understand their rights and responsibilities as well as how the government works. B2, gather, organize, this is the specific expectations, gathers and organize a variety of information and data that present various perspectives about Canadian social and environmental issues. B24, interpret and analyze information and data relevant to investigations using a variety of tools. B25, evaluate evidence and draw conclusions about social and environmental issues. B26, and communicate the results of inquiries and use an appropriate vocabulary. Curricular connections, understand big ideas. So Indigenous cultures and societies are diverse and deeply connected to land, language, and traditions. Understanding Indigenous histories and perspectives is essential for reconciliation and peace building. Activism and allyship play a crucial role in supporting Indigenous rights and social justice. Essential questions. So these are kind of like my probing questions. What is diversity? How do Indigenous cultures and societies reflect diversity? What can we learn from Indigenous history and traditions? What is reconciliation and how can we contribute to it in our classroom or in the world? And what are the Indigenous rights and how can we support activism? So these are the core competencies. This is what we're going to be doing. Communication, engaging in discussions and presentations and reflections on Indigenous perspectives, critical thinking, evaluating historical and contemporary issues affecting Indigenous communities, personal awareness and responsibility, reflecting on personal connections to Indigenous history and reconciliation, social responsibility, understanding allyship, and activism and supporting Indigenous rights. Curricular competencies, evaluate, draw and conclusions about historical and social issues related to Indigenous people, formulate questions and conduct inquiries into Indigenous history and reconciliation and activism, apply knowledge to develop plans for action and social justice and Indigenous rights, use storytelling and creative expression to explore personal and cultural identity. So the content we're going to be focusing on the diversity of Indigenous cultures and languages and traditions, historical interactions between Indigenous people and European settlers, the impact of colonization and confederation on Indigenous communities, the role of activism in addressing Indigenous social issues, and the significance of Indigenous storytelling and personal identity. Assessment for learning, formative. We're going to be having class discussions to assess prior knowledge and understanding. Think, pair, share activities on Indigenous European interactions. We're going to be reading and having paragraph writing on Stolen Words by Melanie Florence. Brainstorming and group discussions on reconciliation and activism. Assessment, AS for learning, reflective, self-reflection, reflections on Indigenous histories and personal identity, peer feedback on storytelling and presentations, goal-setting exercises related to allyship and activism, and journaling on Indigenous perspectives and reconciliation efforts. Assessment of learning, summative, group presentations on Indigenous European interactions and reconciliation strategies, a creation of an IM poem exploring personal identity through an Indigenous lens, research projects on Indigenous social issues and activism, timeline activity on key events in Indigenous history and early Canadian colonization, unit at a glance. So planning essentials includes opportunities for differentiation and student choice, aligns with social studies, histories, and geography curriculum. 1 day lessons focusing on specific aspects of Indigenous history and activism. So these are some of the learning opportunities, cross-curricular connections, language arts, reading comprehension, poetry, and art, visual storytelling. Indigenous perspectives incorporates Indigenous voices, histories, and worldviews. Inquiry-based learning, students formally and investigate questions on Indigenous history. Technological integration using online resources, videos, and research tools. Community learning, encourages engagement with Indigenous stories and traditions, and sustainability and environmental awareness explores Indigenous relationships with the land. Other considerations, differentiated learning, options for written, visual, and oral responses, student grouping, opportunities for independent and partner and group work, student voice and choice, encouraging students to explore topics of personal interest, and anxiety reduction, supportive learning with clear expectations on reflective activities. So this is a day-to-day overview. Week 1, we're going to be having an introduction to Indigenous cultures and diversity, read Stolen Words by Melanie Florence, and discuss the importance of language, explore Indigenous storytelling and traditions. Week 2, investigate the Indigenous European interactions, examine the impacts of colonization and confederation, group discussions and research on Indigenous rights. Week 3, study reconciliation and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, develop and workshop the IM poem, peer feedback and self-reflection activities. Week 4, research Indigenous activism and allyship, finalize research projects and presentations, and present a culminating task and reflect on learning. So these are some of the detailed lesson plans. Lesson 1, understanding Indigenous identity. Objective, students will explore Indigenous cultural diversity through storytelling, activities, read stolen words, discuss themes, and create identity webs. Assessment, a formative paragraph on language and identity. Lesson 2, colonization on its impact. Objective, students will investigate historical Indigenous European interactions, activities, timeline creation, and small group discussions, research tasks. Assessment, formative, think, pair, share discussions, group research. Here are some, these are some differentiated learnings for grade 5 Indigenous unit, offering various ways for students to engage with and demonstrate their learning, and differentiated learning strategies for grade 5 Indigenous studies, focusing on students with differentiated learning. Written responses, these are some of the different learnings that we can implement in the classroom. Simplified prompts, provide clear and simple writing prompts with sense starters. Graphic organizers, use mind maps or diagrams to help structure ideas. Peer support, pair students with peers for feedback and assistance. Visual responses, visual learning, have students use drawings or pictures to explain concepts. Multimedia projects allow students to create videos or slideshows to share with their research. Art projects, students could create art to represent traditional traditions or symbols. Oral responses allow students to present with visual aids like pictures or prompts. Record responses let students record their answers instead of speaking in front of the class. And use technology, text to speech, speech to text. Use tools that text aloud or convert speech to text. And audiobooks, provide audiobooks of readings for easier comprehension. And lastly, allow collaborative learning, small group work in smaller groups for support, and flexible deadlines allow extra time for completing tasks and assignments. And these are some strategies to help students with learning disabilities engage and succeed in their studies, or just any students that have differentiated learning or need any type of support. I don't want it to necessarily be students with disabilities, because anyone could have any type of struggle with learning in their studies. But the reality is we need help for all types of students that have any disabilities to succeed in their studies. And a culminating task, an IM poem and a research project. Objective, students will create a personal identity poem and research in Indigenous social issues. Requirements, the poem must reflect themes of culture, identity, and reconciliation. A research project, investigate Indigenous social issue and present findings. Assessment, summative, I have a rubric below, rubric-based evaluation, peer feedback, and self-evaluation. And this is the rubric right here. Like, I don't think I have enough time to read the entire thing, but it's right here. The rubric, IM poem and a research project. It has the poem content, poem structure and creativity, research depth, presentation and clarity, and reflection and connection. And that is it. Thank you. Hopefully I've made it.
Nice job, Kadar. I like that you included the rubric, to be honest. I know you didn't get to read through it, but